Let's talk for a minute about wood choice. When I first started doing this, one of the challenges I had was finding a piece of wood that was large enough to do a vessel or whatever, but was a fairly clear grain, as you don't want knot holes and dark streaks and that type of thing to distract from your pattern. It also has to be a hard enough wood that it will cut a clean bead and absorb the ink. Here in Utah, that's not easy to come by, and so that was my first challenge. This piece right here is an interesting one because it's actually a piece of aspen, which is extremely soft. Out camping, cutting firewood, and you cut a piece of wood and you say, oh, that's a pretty piece of wood, I'm going to take that home and put it on the lathe. So it actually didn't work too bad. It's got 1/4-inch beads on it, and they're burned. They're not painted or inked, they're burned. And I just started burning beads, every other one, until I got to here and realized I didn't calculate my pattern, so there's 2 of them together, which doesn't bother me a bit on this one. This is one of my favorite pieces and it's one of my first pieces. But this was the exception to the rule, being able to find a piece that actually could be done, and it worked out. I'd done a little bit of segmented turning, open and closed segment, so I had the sled, and so I thought, well, I'm going to try that. Before that, I have this piece. I keep trying to hide it. My wife finds it and puts dried weeds in it and puts it on the counter. The problem with this one is I glued 2 pieces together of maple, and you can see where the end grain is. It's a different color because it absorbed the ink differently. See that contrast? That's end grain is the darker part and side grain is the lighter part. I probably shouldn't have glued it together this way, but that's the problem you have when you're working with a piece that has end grain and side grain. So back to the segmenting again. So what I ended up doing is starting to make segmented rings and stacking them on top of each other. And so I come up with something like this. And so I'd start with this solid piece of maple with a tenon on it that would go in my chuck, and then I would take these rings, it's a segmented ring, and this one's sanded on both sides, but I would sand it until I had a good surface on one side, and then just start building the rings up. After I got the rings built up, I cut a tenon in here that I can put my large chuck into and expand the jaws, and then I'll turn it around, put it on the lathe, and turn this outside profile first. So this is basically what I would end up with this profile turned, and then another tenon cut so that I can turn it around and put it back in a chuck and turn the inside. And that way, you can see an outside profile better than you can the inside profile. So by turning this first, which is just opposite of what you do when you turn a bowl, turning this first, then I can follow that wall thickness as best I can down to turn the inside and turn the beads. And so what that gives me then is basically side grain all the way around. And that works really nice. For the most part, I don't use anything but hard maple. and I select it myself at the lumber yard to get as white and straight a grain pieces as I can, so that it all goes away. Now these little boxes, which is what the demonstration is, it's the same process. Rings like that, they're glued together. This is a hard maple top and a hard maple bottom. Most of this surface will be turned away and gone because there is end grain there. Right there, some tear out on some end grain. And most of this will be turned away. What I do with this is there's a tenon on this piece that goes down into there about 1/4 of an inch. Same with the bottom, so that I can turn as much of that away as I want, make it disappear. And I like to thread them for a couple of reasons. It's kind of cool for one thing, but the main thing is when I start burning the division lines on here, I make sure that lid's on really tight, and then I burn the division lines and do the coloring and everything, and then I'll loosen the lid up a little bit if I need to. But the key is so that when the lid goes closed and tight, your pattern lines up. If the lid's loose, when it gets closed tight, your pattern's off, and that's really distracting. So that's the material I use. There's one other one here that I really like that's hard to get without a knot hole or two, and this is mountain mahogany. And I really enjoy doing basket pieces on this because it's just really hard. It cuts clean. It takes ink well. It's just a nice wood to work with. You can see how crisp those threads are on that. And the secret to this is finding, because this is just a limb. This was a limb probably 4 inches in diameter, maybe a little less, is to find something with a small pith. Now that pith's a little bit large because as it dries, it'll crack and split if I'm not careful. But so if I find a small pith, and then let that dry for a long time, then I can turn a box out of that with basket pattern on it, and it ends up really nice.